Okay, welcome to part 3 of the American Evolution. This lecture is on Shays Rebellion. Now, across the nation, when the war had ended, there was an economic depression, right? Every single state had to deal with this. The federal government cannot tax under the Articles of Confederation. They have all these debts to the states. They can't pay them, so they're just going to cancel them. They're just going to basically tell them, you know that money we owe you? You're never going to see it. That doesn't make the debt go away. What that means is that the monies that these states had hoped to gather from the federal government to pay their own debts now just becomes debt that they've incurred. Now, in the case of Massachusetts, they've issued a lot of paper money. So do other states. And this paper money is pretty much worthless. As I mentioned in the last lecture, that Massachusetts money by the end of the war was worth only 1/40th of its face value. So Massachusetts' response to this was to purchase it back. We're going to buy it back, but we're only going to buy it back in exchange for specie at face value. Okay. Now, if you were a speculator who had hoarded a lot of this paper script, that's great, right? Because you're buying it for 1/40th of its worth of its face value. Now you're going to get its face value in specie. But for the average person, like for example farmers who have been using this desperately trying to pay off their debts, this is going to cause a lot of problems. They don't have specie. Now, to raise the money to purchase this back, Massachusetts decides that they are going to institute a new tax, right? Land taxes will be the bulk of it. A 500% increase in taxes that will be levied through some excise taxes, but about 80% of it is going to be through land taxes. Now, again, if you're a farmer, you own most of the land. Now you have this new land tax, a 500% increase on your land tax, and it must be paid in specie, which you don't have, right? Most farmers actually trade it in barter, and this, of course, is the worthless paper script, okay? So you can't pay these taxes. What happens? Well, these farms start to go into foreclosure. Farmers are under distress. They begin to demand relief. Now, the governor of Massachusetts probably should have seen what was going to happen next. Governor James Bowdoin had experienced some unrest due to taxation in Massachusetts before. In 1782, 4 years prior to this incident, they had issued a similar tax, which had caused an uprising in Hampshire County in western Massachusetts. It was led by an itinerant preacher named Samuel Ely. Samuel Ely threatened to raise a mob to shut down the courts and prevent any foreclosures based on that tax. Now, here we are 4 years later, in 1786, we have this new 500% tax, and sure enough, in Hampshire County, you're going to have an uprising again. This time it's going to be led by a group of former Confederate officers, right? And again, they are going to shut down the courts, right, in August of 1786. A couple of weeks later, there'll be an attempt to open the courts in Worcester County, right next to Hampshire County, with the same result. An angry mob will come in there, and they'll prevent the courts from opening, right? On September 11th, 1786, Middlesex, which is only 20 miles outside of the county which Boston resides in, also tried to open their courts. Again, same results. You had an angry mob that would descend upon there and prevent the courts from opening, okay? A couple weeks later, on the 23rd of September, 1786, the Massachusetts Supreme Court will attempt to hold its session in Springfield, Massachusetts. They had felt that they had planned ahead. They had brought with them a militia of approximately 1,000 men under the command of General William Shepherd, right? But the rebellion or the resistance to these courts opening had more men, over 1,200 that will arrive there in Springfield, and a leader, a former Revolutionary War captain by the name of Daniel Shays. Okay. Now, the court will allow to start session because of the protection of that militia. However, Daniel Shays' men will have the capability to prevent people from coming into the court, like, for example, jurors. And for that reason, even the Massachusetts Supreme Court is going to have to shut down, right? Now, all of these courts will make the decision to attempt to reconvene in November, right? But when November came around, you're going to see the same thing. Every court that tried to open, you'll have Shayites, as they'll be called, surround the courts and prevent the courts from conducting any business, right? The fear that developed out of this was the fact that in Springfield, there was the only federal army in the United States. It had been commissioned by George Washington himself in 1777, and this is where all of the arms from the American Revolution were stored. The U.S. Army, even though it's small, it still has a lot of equipment. And the worry became is, what if Daniel Shays and his men were to attack and capture the Springfield Armory? Well, they were thinking exactly that, right? And in February of 1787, they will attempt to do this. However, they will be thwarted. First of all, you're going to have General William Shepard. He will have already had garrisoned that armory, anticipating Shays' move. And at the same time, you're going to have, in January of 1787, Governor Bowdoin had called for a 4,400-man militia to be placed under the command of General Benjamin Lincoln, right? Now, Shepard's men in the armory is going to tell Shays' men to disperse. And when they don't, Shepard, having no inclination of humoring these guys, will fire his artillery through their ranks and kill 4 of Shays' men. They'll end up going on the run, and a group of them, about 150 of them, will be captured in February. But the rebellion at this point is effectively over. Now, Shays' Rebellion had been a failure, but despite that, it sent shockwaves of fear across all of the colonies, right? Not for what happened, but for what could have happened. All the what-ifs started popping into everybody's heads. Like, what if the militia had balked on defending against Shays' uprising? What if they had joined them? What if Shays had successfully taken the armory? What if a foreign nation had offered aid? What if this was in the South and it was a slave rebellion that couldn't be put down? All of these different things were going through their minds, right? Every single one of these 13 states was terrified about the potentiality of what could have happened, right? It proved, though, without a doubt, that the Articles of Confederation were too weak, that they just were not workable as they were. There was too much liberty, not enough security. So as a result of this, it's going to play a role in the decision to meet for a constitutional convention in 1787 in Philadelphia. We need to either fix or replace this document, they said. Of course, right away, one of the very first things that comes up is, well, how do we do that? How do we do this and get all the states to buy into this? Remember, in order to change the Articles itself, you have to have a unanimous approval of all 13 states. How do we get them to approve of any kind of convention, especially if we're going to replace the document? Well, what it does is it brings George Washington back to public life. George Washington, by this point, is a national hero, right? He is the most popular man in the United States. And they'll ask George Washington, who had retired in 1783 after the war was over, to come back from retirement and come be the president of this constitutional convention to give it validity, give it relevance, right? And that, of course, will be the topic of our next lecture.